I think the people side is a great place to start because I think that is probably the most difficult of this discussion. If you look at the average business person in an organization, a lot of the guys who are leading organizations globally today are not necessarily people that have been trained up to appreciate the depth of what this technology change represents in context to creating value for their business.
The world is not the same as it was even 10 years ago, not to speak about 20, 30, decades ago. And therefore, the way that organizations used to operate, given the sort of tools, technology, practices that are available, and also consumer demands that are changing all the time. The way that organizations used to operate can no longer cut it as we move into the future. Something needs to be different.
Hi everyone, welcome to the IT Global Direction. My name is Rorisang Hlahatsi-Baloyi. I'm currently based in Calgary, Canada. Today I have interesting guests from Ghana and South Africa. They will introduce themselves, but the topic for today is digital transformation. That's the topic we're going to expand on today. Oscar, could you please introduce yourself to our viewers?
Sure. Thanks, Rory. Oscar Stark. Day job is very much rooted in the topic that we're discussing today, so I'm quite excited to be here. And I'm looking forward to great engagement with Ivo, if I can kind of introduce you.
Yeah, Ivo, go ahead.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Oscar. Thank you, Rory. My name is Ivo Richardson from Ghana. I guess my day job is around organizational change management. So very much like Oscar, the topic of discussion is also sort of around my area of expertise, and I'm looking forward to discussing and sharing some good insights to amongst ourselves, but also to our audience. Thank you very much, Rory.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ivo. So what is digital transformation? I don't want to expand on a topic that no one understands. Oscar, do you want to go first? What is digital transformation?
Sure. So firstly, let's start off with digital transformation from the perspective that it's not only tech. Actually, and I think that's where a lot of people kind of get it wrong. Digital transformation is the transformation of organizations, be that people, processes, the activities, the offerings that they put into the market, that's actually enabled by what technology can offer them today. And that in itself leads to organizations embracing new business models and actually starting to operate in a different way than what they have envisioned previously.
Yeah. Awesome. Ivo, would you like to expand on that point?
Absolutely. And I'd first like to start by agreeing 100% with my newfound best friend, Oscar. I think he's totally spot on. Digital transformation is about organizations changing to suit the demands and the needs and the exigencies of today. Right. So the world has changed a lot. We're seeing incredible transformations from a technology perspective, from a homogeneity perspective in terms of cultural homogeneity, globalization. We're seeing so much change. The world is not the same as it was even 10 years ago, not to speak about 20, 30, decades ago. And therefore, the way that organizations used to operate, given the sort of tools, technology, practices that are available, and also consumer demands that are changing all the time. The way that organizations used to operate can no longer cut it as we move into the future. Something needs to be different. And digital transformation is the process of making yourself relevant, of ensuring that as an organization, you are deploying the right tools, the right techniques, the right processes, the right technologies in order to be able to ensure that you're meeting the needs, the ever-changing needs of companies and consumers alike. So that's what it is, as Oscar said. And it's really a kind of an interesting crossroads that most of us organizations find ourselves at, because how do we ensure that we take the right decisions and reimagine what we are offering as organizations to our constituents, to our clients and customers to stay relevant? That's really what the challenge is.
Wow. I think both of you beautifully defined it. I think in summary, I could say that from an organization perspective, you said it's people, process, and technology. And you also, Ivo, on your side, you indicated that it's just not for organizations, it's also people, organizations, and the economy of the country, right? So I think we're going to expand on those topics. We're going to try and get the meat part of the bones that you have structured for us. So from a people, process, and technology, how do you foresee organizations moving forward? Because organizations have evolved. So evolution of organizations is not a new thing. So how does this differ from what organizations used to do in the past, evolving and moving to more new and emerging processes and technologies? How would you differentiate this, Oscar?
Yeah, so I think the people side is a great place to start, because I think that is probably the most difficult of this discussion. If you look at the average business person in an organization, a lot of the guys who are leading organizations globally today are not necessarily people that have been trained up to appreciate the depth of what this technology change represents in context to creating value for their business. They've grown up in a world where technology is an enabler to a process. But as people, we kind of miss the point sometimes that the technology now enables a whole new set of capability that we haven't had access to previously. And we can do things in a much more cost efficient and in many cases a much more productive way than what we have been able to do that in the past. And with that comes the advent of, call it a different way of thinking about working within organizations. We used to organizations in the past having very linear kind of production value streams, where in this kind of digital enabled world, you're starting to deal with a world where things actually happen instantaneously. But if you don't start appreciating what that represents to the engagement for your customer, you're not going to gear up your organization or actually train your people to start thinking that way. They might still be stuck in that kind of linear thinking. And that's where people tend to trip themselves up. But having said that, there's a lot of, call it, technical skills development that gets attention from organizations as they look towards this topic. But quite often the softer issues is the ones we really need to focus on. More creative problem solving and actually driving levels of innovation into your organization that starts changing the dial and the way that you actually go about grabbing hold of what digital transformation represents as benefit to your organization.
That's actually interesting, Oscar. I think what you also introduced here is a way of thinking and the way of delivery, linear thinking, as you put it in your own words. Because people would just look at how we can introduce new technologies, how we can change processes, but how that is delivered is not, as you mentioned, that people don't really look into it and look into how now they need to think differently from how they used to think in the past. Ivo, what's your views on this? Any expansion on what Oscar indicated?
First of all, let me start by saying once again, I agree, almost entirely with everything that he said. No wonder he's my newfound best friend. I also agree that the people dimension is probably the most difficult of all the elements that need to come together to make digital transformation happen. And going back to your original question, you were looking at, why is organizational evolution more critical now than ever? Well, look at it. I alluded to it before, that the pace and nature of change that's happening in the world is more than it has ever been before. So therefore, you cannot respond in the same way that you used to respond, maybe 2 decades ago. It just will not work. Now we have hyper competition because globalization is happening at a outstanding rate. Even a small company, some relatively small market in the world can offer you huge competition. That's just the way of the dynamics now. We're seeing the advancement of technology go into crazy levels. Now we have artificial intelligence doing things that are scaring the pants of people. So all of a sudden, the mix and the melting pot is so complex, is so powerful, is so dynamic that the linear approach that Oscar mentioned will no longer cut it. It's no longer good enough. You have to now reimagine things. You have to recreate things in more dynamic, more innovative ways than you've ever done before. That's what the challenge is right now. So what the driving force of that will be, and of course, the OEMs and the consumer electronics organizations that are building newer and newer technologies, they're doing what they're doing, and they're driven also by hyper competition to try and stay afloat and stay relevant. But ultimately, adoption requires us to sort of see the world in a whole different light. And seeing the world in a whole different light, to Oscar's point, is about mindset. It's about how you perceive. It's about how you understand. It's about how you apply. So that's where the whole thing starts. So this is what makes digital transformation an amalgam of not just the technology aspect, but also the process, leadership, strategy, culture. Because once culture comes in, it influences behavior. So there's all of these very powerful forces, very impactful dynamics that are coming into the fray to try and ensure that an organization is taking the right path. Yeah. And that's really where this whole thing is headed to, and it must be driven, first of all, by leadership, as I've said, and then also by the right mindset.
Yeah, just to expand
Lori,
on sorry.
Yeah,
yes,
perhaps just an interesting point here to Eva's observation around kind of the linear and people. We as people think in a linear fashion. That's how we grow up, There's day after day. Technology evolves on an exponential curve. So on average, it doubles its ability every 2 years. That implies that every 2 years, what you can do with tech is a lot more than what you can do today. But that's not how we think about it. And I think that's kind of part of that retraining that Eva refers to, which is kind of fundamental to this conversation.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so just to conclude on this framework, remember from our definition, we developed two frameworks. We said we have people, process, and technology. And on the other side, we're looking at individuals, so people, organizations, and our economy or countries, right? To conclude on this one, if now an organization wants to move to be more digital or more digitally transformed, as we initially described, what are these technologies that we're talking about that can take organizations forward? Because in the past, we had like mainframe, COBOL, just to mention a few of our old technologies. Now, how should organizations know that I am on my way to being digitally transformed? So, Oscar, would you highlight those technologies for us?
Sure. So, the easy ones are, for instance, cloud. And let me just color in what the cloud represents. You make reference to a mainframe, for instance. So in the past, it was only large corporates that could actually afford buying a mainframe. And that mainframe came with X amount of processing capacity. Today, a one-man business can go and spin up the processing capacity in the cloud that represents a mainframe. So that allows a one-man business to have the same computing power that a large corporate was able to sustain in the past. And that's kind of part of where this thing is shifting. So cloud, for instance, actually comes now with the ability to give you access to processing capacity and ready-made services to solve for problems a lot quicker than what you anticipate. With this, there's the adjacencies of, for instance, artificial intelligence. The actual ability of what the technology can do for you, where you're starting to augment some of the human capacity into the electronic space that supports then a higher throughput of productivity. Now, quantum computing is kind of also out there on the horizon. We are still playing around with some of the opportunities there. But in essence, these are the kind of key ones that's fundamentally driving the digital transformation we're seeing at the moment. And so what you're seeing on top of the technology of the cloud, and for instance, artificial intelligence, you have different software service providers who are now starting to package their solution sets as ready-made solutions for organizations to literally switch on and use, as opposed to have to implement and deploy. And that in itself allows them the ability to get benefit a lot quicker than what a traditional organization would.
Yeah.
So when you kind of dial into the point that you asked in terms of, so how would an organization know that they're on this path of transformation? It's a function of being able to embrace these technologies in the context of which your organization operates. But now you're starting to see your performance dynamics are changing quite rapidly. For instance, if you wanted to compute a large chunk of data in an on-prem environment that took you a week, well, now you can do that in literally minutes in the cloud, because you can ratchet up your capacity to get that done. And once you're done, you switch it off. That also comes at a different price point, because you don't have to overinvest in capital outlay for on-prem hardware. You can actually literally just pay as you use. And as I mentioned, that's kind of at a fraction of the cost. So you start seeing that those business levers also start changing from a cost perspective, productivity perspective, as you start embracing what call it technologies that are part of this digital transformation journey represents to the organization.
Well said, Oscar. I'm not sure if Ivo, you wanted to elaborate further on what Oscar mentioned before we move to our next model.
Well, I mean, I think he's answered it so well, it's difficult to elaborate. I just wanted to maybe throw in a couple more of those technologies that that are driving these transformations. For instance, connectivity, right? You know, we're seeing exponential increase in connectivity. We're now, even for mobile technologies, we're now looking forward to 5G, which is as far from 4G as probably 4G is from 2G. It's huge in terms of you know, the step. Data analytics, and the fact that now we have huge amounts of data that we can manipulate in ways that we can make, you know, very powerful, important decisions around. We can now achieve what I learned in my MBA many years ago, what we call the segmentation of one, where you actually provide services, tailored services to an individual level, because you have enough information about that individual to be able to do so. So there's all of these interesting dynamics that are also coming to the party.
Is it safe to also appreciate that they will also evolve further? So what we're discussing today doesn't mean that it's the ultimate way of being digitally transformed. We also need to appreciate that it's going to evolve. Tomorrow, there may be something more that could increase the speed of how we deliver and efficiency, of course.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's where the concern and the fear potentially is of getting left behind. Because if you don't recreate your organizational structures and create a strategy that allows you to be agile and dynamic and be able to be flexible as the change happens, you also change. If you're not able to create that, then you get left further and further behind. And that's really what the cautionary note around digital transformation is about. Is how do you ensure that your organization is ready to embrace ever-changing landscape, is ready to follow along with that. I think it was Justin Trudeau who said something like, the pace of change has never been as fast as it is today, yet will never be as slow as it is today, which means that, you know, we're gonna keep coming up with new things. You know, 5G will probably give way to 6G. AI, as we're seeing it now, will go to a level of robotics that will scare the pants off us. So are we ready? And are we putting the right mechanics in place for our organizations, for our businesses to be able to thrive as these things continue?
Awesome. Second model, I think we're going to be brief on that one, because we're looking at this from a macro perspective now. We were just observing it from a micro perspective. From a macro perspective, we mentioned economies, we mentioned companies, we mentioned individuals, right? How would this impact all these layers going forward? Am I impacted as an individual by an organization digitally transforming, or a country deciding to be more digital in the way it operates from an economic perspective? Oscar, do you want to pick up that one?
Sure. So let's start off with me and I and myself type of problem. The short of it is yes, you are going to be impacted. The average organization is going to expect you to have a set of skills that actually complement what they want to do with these technologies and how they want to operate themselves as an organization. So, and that those skill sets are not only technical, they are soft skills as well. Quite often people argue that the soft skills are the more tricky ones to actually cultivate in people, which I tend to agree with because it presupposes a level of change that you're introducing to people that if they're not used to it, it's going to take you some time. If we then kind of toggle this into organizations and hop all the way up to countries, I think there's an interesting example in what Luxembourg did, for instance. They worked out a skills transformation plan for their whole country and then incentivized corporates to ensure that they start retraining their staff and at large across the country to ensure that the Luxembourg as a country is actually digitally relevant for the future. And the way they did that is they actually paid people salaries while they went on training so that the companies didn't lose the capacity and the revenue while people got retrained. And it's a 6-month process. And through that process, people picked up some of the soft skills and the hard skills. And when they went back to the office, they had a new plateau of skills to offer to organizations. That in itself had a knock-on effect because if you think about it, I've now just acquired a new set of skills. My organization is still thinking about life, call it pre-digital transformation. I'm going to start asking questions and making suggestions around how we can approach some of our problems today, but in a different way. And so in essence, they created a bit of a catalyst mechanism to start forming corporates across Luxembourg. And so the net effect is, as a country, they've kind of risen up through this digital transformation where the individuals got the skills, the organizations are transforming to be more competitive, and Luxembourg as a country is reaping the benefits of it.
Yeah, no, that really makes sense from an individual and organization perspective. I think you elaborated that well. Evolve from an economy, from competing countries, from countries like Estonia that we know that are ahead when it comes to such conversations. What are your observations?
Well, I mean, ultimately, it all comes back to everything that Oscar just said, which is that this whole thing is an ecosystem, but it's an ecosystem that has competitive levers, and you have to then look at those competitive levers and make sure that you're positioning yourself right. So even within country, that Luxembourg example was perfect because it shows how each of these elements depend on the other. The organization, for instance, depends on you from a consumer perspective because what you want is what the organization is primed to try and give you, and that sets off a whole chain of other things that need to come into the picture. So it's an ecosystem. But once we get to the kind of the global level, and we're looking at inter-market or inter-jurisdictional sort of competition, then it becomes even more interesting because how does a country position itself? It enables its organizations, its people, etc., to be able to thrive within the context of how they compete against other countries or other markets. How do you do that? And for me, it really starts from the perspective of two things. First of all, supporting the organizations to be able to take the necessary steps. So creating the conducive environment, that sort of regulatory, legislative, economic environment that helps organizations to now see that they need to reinvent themselves, most of them. And then secondly, providing the necessary framework to ensure that individuals upskill, similar to the example that Oscar gave just now. I think leaders of countries are going to have to look at that. Of course, you have blocks, geopolitical blocks, G7, European Union, BRICS, whatever. You have those, and those blocks are determined to sort of come together and provide certain supports for each other. But the fact of the matter is, when the chips are down, you have to look after your interests as a country. And therefore, the framework that enables your market to thrive, your economy to attract external investors or investments, and your organizations, your companies to be able to not only do well internally, but also potentially do well externally. All of those are very, very important. And that creates pressure on leaders to be able to come up with the right frameworks. It's digital transformation is not just peculiar or relevant for companies. It is relevant for countries as well.
Awesome. There's a lot that has been discussed today. As we conclude, I will try and sum up what we said, and I'm very scared to do this because a lot of points were raised and it was a very interesting conversation. So initially we came up with a model. We said digital transformation is just not about technology. I think in everything we said, from whichever angle we looked at today, we came to that conclusion that digital transformation, it is not technology transformation. We mentioned that as people, process, and technology. We also, on the other hand, we looked at it from a broader perspective where we said that countries also need to keep up. And in order for countries to keep up, they need to support organizations, and organizations need to support individuals to make sure that people are well trained. And I think Oscar raised another critical point that is maybe people don't always think about, is the way of thinking. There's a certain way of thinking that we need to change in order for us to digitally transform. So by us, I mean countries. You also are able to introduce another point of geopolitics. We need to also understand that in order for you as an individual country to be strong, you need to make sure that you also have your plans in a country to make sure that you are digitally transformed. There were a couple of countries that were mentioned. I think I personally highlighted Estonia because it's the one that's always on my face when we talk about digital transformation. And I don't know, what can we do to look up to those countries and see if they are thriving from an economic perspective because they have digitally transformed. I'm not sure if they're competing because they've digitally transformed, but maybe it's a conversation for another day. But for today, I think I tried to sum up everything. It was a lot of information, a lot of very fruitful information that I think our viewers can learn a lot from. But for today, thank you so much. Thank you for sharing your views today. Thank you, Oscar. Thank you, Ivo. I really appreciate your views today.
Absolute
Thank
pleasure.
you very much.
Absolute pleasure.